the area of research that I focus on particularly is the role of the media in communicating climate change and public engagement. And there's a really fierce battle going on behind the scenes to control the news agenda. And this particularly involves the fossil fuel companies, as we've seen earlier on, when Michael Mann was talking about the disinformation campaign, and this has been going on for years. So back in 2007, for example, the American Enterprise Institute, which is a lobby group funded by ExxonMobil, offered scientists each $10,000 if they would write articles that would undermine the or highlight the shortcomings of an IPCC report. And top oil and gas companies spend phenomenal amounts of money on both lobbying and also branding. So the top 5 oil and gas companies spent in the region of $200 million a year on lobbying to block, control, and especially now to delay action on climate change. And in the region of £195 million a year on branding to give the impression that they care about climate change. So in my talk, I want to highlight some of the best practice in terms of how we can engage the public with climate. And as Hannah said at the beginning, I've written a number of books on media coverage of environmental issues. My first one, Media Culture of the Environment, was published back in 1997. And then my most recent single-authored book is Media, Environment and the Network Society. And I go into more detail with the Media, Environment and the Network Society book in terms of what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm also editor-in-chief, or I was editor-in-chief of the journal Environmental Communication for a number of years. So I've been working in climate change communication for the past 30 years. Can you still hear me? Because I can't see the Zoom screen anymore.
Yeah, I can still hear you. I think your connection was a bit weak, so we stopped your video, but hearing is fine. Okay,
brilliant. Okay. Sorry, my slides are stuck now. I don't know if that's to do with the connection. Just bear with me one moment. Let's just go back. Great, okay. So when I think of astronomy, I immediately think of the experience of seeing the total solar eclipse in 1999 in the UK. And I think this was the first total solar eclipse that the UK had experienced since 1927. And it was an incredible experience. I still remember being sat on the bench at the university when everything went dark. And it generated so much interest and excitement at the time. And I think this is one of the real potentials for astronomy, because people are so interested in things like eclipse and comets and so on and so forth. And clearly, you know, much has happened since 1999. The science on climate change has been mounting over that time. You know, we've had this disinformation campaign that we've heard about earlier. Also, we've been distracted by recessions, by wars. You know, we've been told that there's no magic money tree to spend on dealing with the problem of climate change, but you know, there's a lot we can learn from the COVID pandemic, and some of the mistakes that have been made there in terms of communication. I think it was Henry Ford that said that, you know, the biggest mistake we can make is if we don't learn from our mistakes. And astronomers, I would argue, are extremely well placed to engage the public with the climate crisis, because astronomy, clearly is such a highly visual subject. It draws considerable public interest, and images have been shown to be much more effective than words in public messaging. Also, it's pluridisciplinary, and it's wide-ranging. There are so many opportunities to bridge the gap between astronomy and climate science. And it's really encouraging to see the development of new initiatives like the Astronomers for Planet Earth, A4E, that was formed in 2019. And it's clearly generating more and more interest. So there's the open letter that was signed by more than 2,750 astronomers from over 80 countries around the world. So that's really encouraging. Also, we know from a variety of pieces of research that scientists are the most trusted people globally. And I guess it's no surprise to see that politicians are right down. But, astronomers are viewed as being credible scientists. They're seen as being perceived as being independent. And so there's considerable potential for astronomers to engage the public with the issues of climate change. Now, some time ago, what was known as the information deficit model was popular. This was basically a notion that all you had to do was to provide people with more and more information, more knowledge, fill the vacuum in knowledge about climate change, and that would fix the problem. Well, clearly that's not the case, far too simplistic. And what we know from years of social science research is that people's attitudes to climate change are not just shaped by their level of scientific knowledge. Much more important is to consider their values, their identities, and their political views. It's absolutely crucial that we consider these things. We also know that communal values are very much linked with taking action on climate change. And crucially, people have to believe that it is possible to do something and that it will make a difference. So that refers to the importance of efficacy. It's absolutely crucial in motivating action. This idea that we can actually make a difference, we can affect things. And also, it's really important to frame messages in ways that relate to everybody's day-to-day experiences, and to talk in terms of stories, because we know that when people talk about their own personal experience and they provide narratives and stories, those tend to be much more memorable than showing people graphs, for example. We also need to avoid using jargon and consider the kind of language that we use and be very careful in our choice of language. There's some really interesting research that's been carried out by Susan Hassel, which looks at common words that scientists use and then how members of the public perceive those words. And so, just for example, she talks about the way in which, for the public, theory is often translated as just being speculation or a hunch, or uncertainty sounds like somebody scratching their head, or ignorance. So framing is really important to consider as well, particularly in terms of political divisions. So some interesting research by Lorraine Witchmarsh and Adam Corner finds that for centre-right individuals, framing energy efficiency in terms of avoiding waste, rather than the more contentious frame of preventing fuel poverty, is far more effective. And if you're speaking to groups who are more likely to come from a kind of right-wing perspective, then framing climate change in terms of patriotism works better. Whereas with a more left-wing audience, framing climate change in terms of climate vulnerability and the poor is more meaningful. The other really important thing to remember, I think, is that one size does not fit all. So communications needs to be carefully targeted towards specific groups. And we need to ask, these three sort of basic questions. What is the purpose of the communication? Who are we communicating to? And is it the most appropriate format? And this will depend in part on the values and identities of the audience. And this can be, pretty complex, because in addition to political values and cultural perspectives, there are also non-partisan social factors that can play a role here as well, such as gender, social class, and racial and ethnic identities. And also generational differences can be really important to bear in mind as well. We know that younger people tend to be less sceptical of the science of climate change, and also considering different ways in which people access media. So we know that people under the age of 35 are far more likely to use social media to access their news and have more trust in social media. There are, however, a number of potential pitfalls to avoid when communicating climate change and engaging with the public. First of all, there's a danger of potentially exacerbating polarisation. And so it's worth bearing in mind and considering ways in which we can think about shared values and frames that appeal widely to a number of people. So, for example, the frame of avoiding waste is something that appeals to people from a wide range of political perspectives. Also, the danger of too much doom and gloom. As we've heard earlier on, it's really important to emphasise the solutions to climate change that that are available to us. If people hear too much catastrophic messaging, they just turn off. They feel overwhelmed, they feel disempowered, as though they can't do anything. And clearly that's counterproductive. And then there's also the language of uncertainty as well, which has clearly been a particular problem in the past. And now, there's this language of inaction as well, which relates to the other point about too much emphasis on doom and gloom. So it's important to consider how we talk about solutions when we are engaging the public with climate change. And here again, thinking about language as well, because this can be crucially important. Susan Hassel talks about the way in which words like regulate, restrict, control, tax, that immediately antagonizes some people. Whereas if you choose to use words like ingenuity, entrepreneurship, innovation, those are much more acceptable. So it pays to really think carefully about choice of language. And there's also the danger of this is a particular problem, with platforms like Twitter, where you can share fake news, but if you don't actually give the context to it, then unintentionally you might reinforce that fake news without actually meaning to. And then finally, it's really important, I think, to contextualise climate risk through emphasising the local aspect, because this is what people relate to. This resonates with them and provides a hook, because otherwise climate change can be experienced as being quite abstract. And, you know, as we are seeing these, you know, climate change events happening around us now, many ways in which we can draw on local experiences. So this is just a quote taken from a scientist who we interviewed as part of a study looking at the views of scientists and other stakeholders about the importance of local media in covering climate change. And here I think this draws attention to the importance of relating engagement with climate change to local experiences, whether that's air pollution or whether that's flooding. It's something that people relate to and makes it more meaningful to their everyday life. And then finally, I think that the organisational culture and resources are absolutely fundamental. There have been a number of surveys that have been carried out of astronomers over recent years about their public outreach, asking them how much public outreach they do, what channels do they use, and what are the barriers. And what these surveys show is that those scientists working, you know, it's not surprisingly, with more resources from their institutions, were also the ones who were the most active communicators. And we find that they tend to be more senior, they tend to be more motivated as well. There's a real need, I think, for universities and for funding agencies to reward and incentivize this public outreach work more. Having said that, though, there is, you know, it's really important to have the support and training from communications that was written by Williamson and colleagues, embedding climate change engagement in astronomy education, that suggests that poorly executed climate science communication can make the problem worse. So it's really important that investment is placed in training and in also, you know, thinking about which astronomers perhaps, you know, might have the most credibility, you know, which ones have kind of celebrity status that perhaps would play an important role in engaging the public. So just to finish then, in terms of guides for best practice around engaging the public in climate change communication, there are so many resources out there now, and I've just included a few here, a few websites that might be useful to take a look at. So thank you very much.